Hi, everyone. Welcome to the session on the scientists and society in our RCR seminar series. After today, we've got another session on Friday where we're going to talk about collaborative science. Next Monday, we talk about data management, and on May 21st, there'll be a session on international research. So that one's not up on the website yet, but we'll be getting that up later today. And if you have questions about how many sessions you've attended, just send me an email and I can check my database and tell you how many you've attended. So today we have speaking David Winickoff, who is from the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management. He's a professor of bioethics and science.
Thank you. Thanks, Erica. Pleasure to be with you guys today. I want to talk with you about the scientist and society, but more, I guess, aptly, science and society, because I'm interested, I want you guys to get interested in the individual, the scientist, and the figure of the scientist, but also about science as an institution and how it relates to the rest of society. So my background is actually in law and the humanities, and also the sociology of science and technology. I'm in an environmental department, and I do a mix of biomedical, working on biomedical topics, specifically ethics, law, and sort of policy around biotechnology, various kinds, as well as work in environmental policy. So I'm working on some climate change type things. I work on international environmental governance around food and a few other things. I've been here at Berkeley. This is my 7th year. I teach a large bioethics class on campus for undergrads, about 140 people, about half of whom are scientists or trained to be scientists. I don't teach science grad students that much. It's certainly not in the kind of lab kind of scientists. I sometimes teach the ecology kind of graduate student. But I wanted to get a sense of, from you guys, how many of you are in graduate school, like right now, trying to get your PhD? Okay, and how many are postdocs? Okay, and how many are other? Okay, so great. So a lot of postdocs, I'd say. The majority is postdoc, or at least half. So what about field? How many are in the life sciences? And physical sciences, engineering? Okay, great. So I want to talk a bit, I want to give you a little bit of I guess, historical overview of some major shifts in how science as an institution and as a set of practices has developed or changed, especially at a particular pivot point. I see a major pivot point in the 1970s, and especially around the discovery of recombinant DNA around 1973. And I'll tell you why or suggest why later, but I want to start by talking about the vision post-World War II. How many of you have heard of science, the endless frontier? No one. How many of you have heard of Vannevar Bush? A couple of people. Okay. So Vannevar Bush was President Truman's top scientific advisor. And coming out of World War II, where a vast amount of resources had been spent on weapons and industrial production, a lot of engineers went to work for the government, there was a big question, well, what do we do with this capacity? We have a big scientific capacity. What are we going to do? And Vannevar Bush thought that if the country did not continue to invest in science, that economically things would fall apart, and that in terms of protecting the country in the face of the Cold War, things would not be safe. So he concocted, through a very famous policy brief called Science, the Endless Frontier, the idea that if the US spends directly a huge amount of money on science and leaves science pretty much alone, so not getting too much into the details, but letting scientists do their own peer review, regulate themselves, this will in turn, this will pay off in terms of products, in terms of national security, and so forth. And so his view was scientific autonomy and money in exchange for good stuff. Economic health, products, national competitiveness, all that sort of thing. And this was broadly termed the social contract for science, this idea of a quid pro quo. Now, Bush's vision didn't come into being exactly. He had this vision of the NSF being a huge agency that was totally run by scientists. It ended up being a much smaller agency with some kind of oversight. A lot of government money ended up not going through NSF. But some piece of his vision remained. And I would argue some of the ideology of the social contract for science still is with us to some extent. That many scientists feel that what they do is not the government's domain, except maybe if they're funded through the government. But that what they do will be societally beneficial. Broadly speaking, scientists feel like this is not only interesting work, I'm doing it to some extent for its own sake, but it's good, this is good for society, this is good for the world. So this broke down a bit at various points along the way. And the tension within that contract is, on the one hand, can science oversee itself? Is it competent to make sure there's integrity within the Republic of Science? And is science producing the goods? Like, is science actually generating the stuff that society wants? And the whole model of innovation inherent or implicit in the social contract is what's known as the linear model of innovation, where you do the scientific work. Whoops, come on, this is a engineering and science building, and I can't use a, no. Okay. Are you sure it's a dry erase?
It's got an eraser on
Okay.
the tip.
Okay.
Implies that it is.
I'm sure you guys could invent a solvent if this doesn't work. Okay, so the idea is, okay, we are making basic scientific discoveries. It'll somehow get pushed out for commercialization, and we'll get sort of an end product. So we have like a R&D phase, basic discovery, R&D phase, pushing towards a product or a commercialization. So this is all, there we go. Fast forward to the 70s, and a few things happened that implicated both the question of integrity of research and also this model. So the integrity of research, Tuskegee experiment, the details of that experiment came to light. How many of you have heard of that? Okay, almost everyone. Have you had that in this class? No. In the human subjects. Okay, so the whole idea of, there wasn't a notion of a robust human subject oversight system until the 70s. There was a push for it in the wake of Tuskegee. That's a major new term in that social contract. But that's on the integrity side, integrity of research. There was a sense that in that U.S. industry was flagging in the 70s, and there was an idea that we needed to do something to ramp up commercialization of research in the universities. And so Congress passed a piece of legislation called the Bayh-Dole Act. Have you heard of that? Okay, so this act basically means, this impacts you, it basically means that patentable inventions coming out of federally funded research are owned by the university, or the university has an option to take ownership of that invention. And the university has an obligation to pay a royalty to let the inventor, the actual inventor, have a royalty from any commercialization, any royalties coming in. So how many of you have filed a patent? Okay. And has it been from federal funding or through commercial sponsorship? Both. Okay. So obviously this is so much a part of the culture of life science now, when it really wasn't before. And this is where I think recombinant DNA and new biotechnologies helped usher in a moment, and I'm working on a paper now basically arguing that it's not just the Bayh-Dole Act. It's a mixture of the recombinant DNA discoveries with this changing ideology of what the university should be, with this piece of legislation which empowered universities to take ownership of these entities or these inventions. And that together in a kind of alchemy, that has created what we have today, which you might call the entrepreneurial university. So the idea that universities need to be bold, leverage their intellectual property, leverage IP also to bring in partnerships with commercial entities, create the QB3s of the world to actually do some of this boundary work. And that it's not this sort of passive entity that will push out research, the equivalent of this guy, but actually to realize that this stuff kind of operates within a system, and there's an innovation ecosystem, and university is one piece of this and has to find ways to engage this ecosystem. Meanwhile, so let's put that to the side. Meanwhile, besides the human subjects oversight issues that are rising in the 70s, you have a controversial new biotechnology. So the idea that you can splice in genes, you can cross the species barrier. Do you guys know about the Asilomar conference and the history in the 1970s? How many of you have heard of the Asilomar? Okay, good. If you're able to read this, then great. But this was a very important, very interesting and famous and pivotal moment in science and society relations for a lot of reasons. It illustrates a time when Paul Berg and the scientists around him took responsibility to call for a moratorium on a line of research which potentially they thought could have health and safety implications. But they took it on themselves to control that process of how regulation might develop. Now, some of you may work in, how many of you work with recombinant DNA? How about synthetic biology? So synthetic biology now is going through some similar kinds of things as recombinant DNA, figuring out what kinds of safety mechanisms or safety oversight is necessary. Synthetic biology has the added issue of dual use, so potential weaponization. So there's even an extra layer. going back to the 70s, so these scientists took it on themselves. They had this nice Asilomar conference at Asilomar at that nice facility on the ocean. If you haven't been there, you should check it out. And they decided, or they created this structure of like potentially dangerous experiments, middle experiments, and safe experiments. And then Berg was very closely allied or was very tight with the head of Department of Health and Human Services secretary. And so he basically lifted the kind of regulatory structure that was proposed by the scientists at this meeting and put it into the regulations. That's basically what happened. So enter Cambridge, Massachusetts. A lot of ways, equivalencies with Berkeley. Liberal, at that point, extremely kind of politicized and almost radicalized around the war. Yet you have Harvard, which was a fairly traditional institution. And so, and this is kind of what I want to get your feedback on. So if you read the article, you'll know this, but basically some biologists at Harvard wanted to do some of this recombinant DNA research. There was the federal regulations already set up. And they wanted some just everyday permits to construct their laboratories and build a building. And the Cambridge City Council said, no, we don't think this is safe. We think that our citizens actually are potentially at risk from your experiments. No. And we're empowered as sort of the city council to say no. And what do you think the scientists said? What do you think the scientists said? They what?
They had with the experiment?
No, they didn't go ahead. That would have been unlawful. But they weren't very happy about it, right? This to them was interfering with scientific freedom, scientific autonomy. They say, look, not only do we think this stuff is safe, we already have federal regulations. You're just piling on these regulations. You don't know this biology. We know the science. And we know that the existing regulations are adequate for what we want to do. This is ridiculous. Are we in like a Soviet system here? So what did the council do? They didn't veto it, but they decided to create what they call the Cambridge Experimental Review Board, composed of lay members of the community, to basically generate an opinion as to what the city should do. So let me ask you, do you think that this is appropriate? That a local government, let's take synthetic biology and Berkeley. So that Berkeley might say to University of California approaches the city wanting some permits for a new synthetic biology building, and Berkeley says, and Berkeley, UC says, we have complied with the safety parameters of the federal regulations, and we kindly request, as is pro forma, permits for this building. And Berkeley says, that stuff is like dangerous. That stuff is maybe dangerous, and this could harm our people, and we think it's really controversial. So we're going to hold off, and we're going to appoint a lay panel to hear and decide. Okay, so how many of you think that that's appropriate for the city to do that? It's okay, don't be shy. Okay, so only a few, okay, and how many think it's inappropriate? Okay, more. Okay, so why is it inappropriate exactly?
Well, I was thinking that it's just outside of the scope of the city. They're following the regulations of the federal government, and that they just don't really have the expertise. I guess it just comes to mind. I think of the things that cities do. Some maybe not as severe as this, but like the nuclear free zone signs that you see on the edges of the city. I find that sort of stuff silly. So I guess that's my opinion.
So two things I heard in particular. Well, besides the silly part. One reason is the federal government does this, and they probably do it adequately. And presumably the idea is, to finish the argument, if every little municipality did this sort of thing, it would be really inefficient and kind of outside their political authority, potentially. The second one was they don't have the expertise. They don't have the technical capacity to make a good judgment. Okay, so how about someone who thinks that maybe they have some kind of right to do this? Where's the microphone? Okay.
I'd say the comparable cases are things like building an oil refinery or building a nuclear power plant or building an incinerator. And these are things that are safe. There are federal regulations in place, but a particular community may or may not feel comfortable with that right in their midst. And there may be things that the federal regulations don't cover. And if the scientists can't make an argument that is intelligible to the lay public as to why this is safe, then I think that the public has a right to say, we don't want that going on here. I think it's on a scientist to justify that it is safe and to have a reasonable jury that's going to, I don't know, I guess I believe that scientists could make their point if it was truly safe.
So, okay, so a couple of things. I think that was really well put. One is that, I liked how you put it, that the onus is on the science. If people are resistant or they're suspicious, the onus should be on the scientist to be able to communicate it in such a way that it is acceptable, acceptable. And you drew an analogy to an incinerator or a nuclear power plant. Looking to the lay person, that's looking less safe these days in the wake of the Japanese disaster. But what about this idea? Isn't it like an incinerator? You don't think that people should have a say in whether or not an incinerator should be sited in their city?
No, I think that's a great analogy, and it's a good point. It's just like, I guess I just get worried to the point that where the city would gridlock things to a point that it's I don't know. I'm just worried about them having that control, I guess, and being able to in the case of like a established university, maybe just slowing things down, gridlocking things to a point that things are being held up, but it's he makes good points that absolutely maybe it should be the responsibility of the scientists to approach the city council.
Well, let's set the efficiency. So you have this is a third kind of intuition of yours, which I agree with, that cities are just slow. Like permitting is a disaster. Like it takes years. But let's take that off the table and think about, let's assume that they're pretty expeditious. Like if they think it's okay, they're gonna get that through. But what they're going to do is if something is controversial, they're going to take a little bit longer. And I think your valid point, though, is that I would think even that subjects sort of science and the progress of science to the whims of a kind of local government. Like there's a problem of capture to some extent. So just as, it's a problem if the corn industry has all of the important seats on the agricultural committee, there's a problem. So I guess I think you can see that there's a fundamental issue here, which is, do you want to get in here?
Yeah, I just had this is slightly or similar to states and local school boards, passing laws to not teach evolution or teach climate change in schools, right? So it is the concept of like what you have state rights and local municipality rights, and when does that hinder progress in science?
It's a good analogy. I mean, it's different in a number of ways, but in the sense that you have the local claiming authority over a particular sphere. Here, it's not permitting space out of the interest of safety of students or safety of citizens of the city. It's out of, let's say, the educational interest, which is also tends to be configured as a local interest. I mean, this is one of the interesting things so classically, it's a bit of an aside, but I guess I'll just take you down this little aside in my mind. But basically, so health, safety, and education are historically sovereign rights. So when the states formed the federal government, those stayed with the states. They were very careful to save certain powers, and that's why the health law, issue is on the table. That health isn't a federal power at all. But it's being channeled through the Commerce Clause, a specific power in the Constitution. But your case is nice, and it pits the local government against the state on a matter of education, not permitting, but also on the issue of a scientific issue. And I think we can get to that case, and we could probably talk about that for a long time. Let's stick with this one for now. And so, I mean, this fundamental, are you raising your hand? So you can see that the dynamic at play is this one of control. And where does control appropriately lie? Does control over science lie within the scientific community or within a society? And the actual answer is it's both. It's a shared kingdom. It's shared. It's shared through oversight. It's shared through funding. It's rare that you get such a clear tension between the two, a kind of civic constituted power and a kind of scientific authority kind of configuring power. You see it a bit in the case of evolution. And outside the realm of regulation and oversight, you see it in, like I was saying before, a bit the funding. I mean, so much still. I mean, we think that corporate funding is growing into this huge thing at the university. It is growing, but it's still, I think, at most places, 9% or 10% of research funding at a big university is corporate funded. So that's 90% coming from the federal government. And that's contracts, right? They can stipulate certain things. And except for some NSF stuff and maybe some NIH stuff, a lot of it is directive funding. It's sort of project-targeted funding. So, okay. And not only that, these economic policies or these commercialization policies and realities of the university indicate just how messy whatever supposed boundary there is between scientific institutions and societal institutions. How many of you guys are involved in a company? So do you mind talking about it a little bit?
Sure.
Okay.
What about it?
Just tell, what do you do? What does it do?
I've been involved in founding a couple companies that are biotech companies, cancer genomic sequencing, for example, or development of therapeutics for chronic pain.
And so is there intellectual property behind it?
Yes and no. I mean, there are patents that went into the company, but I wouldn't say that either was a direct kind of result of discrete patents that were developed at a university.
So did you found the companies?
In one case, yes, and no.
So why did you found the company?
To help bring scientific discoveries to a practical benefit for patients.
So, this is a huge change. It's a big shift. I commend to you a really good book by a historian of science named Steve Shapin, and it's called The Scientific Life. And he tells a kind of transition or change in the moral life of the scientist through the 20th century. And he really documents the just different ethic, especially in biology, that's developed. And not in a negative way. He's not describing it in a negative way. He's just saying this is a shift. In fact, so Cohen and Boyer, they have the most famous patent in biotech history, and probably in the history of biology at this point, to this point. So they have the recombinant DNA patents, or they used to. It's now expired. But Cohen, he said, Stanford, you take the royalty. I don't want the royalty. Now, he didn't realize that this would turn into a $300 million patent. One of the most lucrative patents in the life sciences. But he was concerned that he would be perceived as interested in his own gain somehow, and that this went against sort of the traditional statement of the norms of science, the old Mertonian norms of disinterestedness. And but now it's in many communities it's positively embraced, and sometimes because this helps get stuff out. That's the rationale. But it's also embraced as just being, let's be dynamic, let's be bold, let's be entrepreneurial. It's a way to bring some money in to do my science. So it can be, but it's just much more part of the ethos. Would you say, does that resonate with you, or do many of you think, no, my advisor or I still have a strong desire, and we think it's right to put some pretty firm boundaries between the world of commerce and the world of what we do kind of in our lab or in our... Anyone want to weigh in on that? Sort of thoughts on that either way? No thoughts? Yeah.
Well, I guess one thing I'd say is in many cases it's actually not possible to pursue a technology beyond a certain point in the academic context. The funding requirements for running, human clinical studies just become too great for something that can be funded even by the NIH. So you really have, if you want to push something forward, sometimes you actually don't have a choice. And then you have the question of, to what extent should you be involved? And I think for me and many other people I know, it's a matter of, if you want something done right, you want to retain some influence over its trajectory once it gets into that context. So there's a clear imperative to be involved.
Yeah. One thing that I'm working on right now that builds off that is, that's absolutely right. One of the implications of that, or I guess one of the pieces of that, is that in order to get the funding that you need in the life sciences to develop, let's say, for drug development, you need a lot of money to get through clinical trials. There's no way that you can license something very broadly, let's say. So when you have a patent, you can license it in many, many ways. You can decide how to give people access to your invention. You could just put it on the web. You could never patent. You could not patent at all. But if you do patent, you have total control. You're a total gatekeeper of access to your patent. And so when you make an invention here, you and your research contracts, employment contracts, have agreed to divulge your invention to the University Tech Transfer Office. The Tech Transfer Office will decide whether they want to pursue the patent, whether they think it's valuable. Oftentimes, they'll try to get a partner before they decide to patent and say, well, are any partners interested in my patent? But let's say they decide to do the patent. Let's say they see it's hugely valuable. They go ahead. The question is, how do you license it? You can license it to sort of everyone who comes, and for not that much, right? Because if you have it very broadly, then there's no monopolistic power that you're granting anyone. And this is how the Cohen-Boyer patent was licensed, very broadly, but everyone had to pay something to do recombinant DNA stuff. And since it wasn't that much, there wasn't a huge amount of grumble. But people just needed that to do as a research tool for other kinds of things. But if you have, if you've discovered or invented, let's say, a molecule that might have some therapeutic value for a disease, you will not be able to find a commercial partner who will take anything but an exclusive license for that molecule. Because if they're going to give you money up front, it's so risky and so time-consuming. It takes, by some counts, although I think this is inflated, $1 billion to get to a drug. I think it's probably like half of that. But still, they need the ability to charge monopolistic prices on the other side. So there's no way that they'll agree to this. But what does this mean then? This means that the university, whose mission, at least in part, is to extend knowledge into society, to the old tradition of the land-grant university here. Do you guys know that that Berkeley is a land-grant university? Do you know what the land-grant university is? Okay, we'll get to that because you guys got to know this. So universities, who in theory are kind of in the business of being open, of providing knowledge, not limiting access in very strong ways, suddenly, because they have this function, they are in the business to some extent of being a gatekeeper, right? They actually are blocking access to an invention that was developed in the walls of their university, whatever way you slice it, that's blocking a lot of people's access. But under the idea that this is the way to push something out at the other end, and or to make a nice revenue stream for the university, because that's definitely a piece of what they want to do. In the early 2000s, this tension between the new entrepreneurial university and the mission of providing things more openly came to a violent head on the campus of Yale, where student activists started protesting the tech transfer office at Yale and the president's office. In collaboration with Doctors Without Borders, they discovered that Yale had licensed the key patent for one of the most important AIDS medications that at that point were well out of the reach of people in South Africa. So South Africa had a patent system, and I think it was GSK, or no, it was Bristol Myers Squibb, who took an exclusive license from Yale to develop this, developed it into Zerit. It was being held at a very high price because South Africa had a patent system, and a lot of people were dying in South Africa from AIDS at that time. Doctors Without Borders alerted people, students at Yale, students came together to lobby the university and said, universities are about the dissemination of knowledge, and this university is basically complicit in extracting money instead of providing medications. Now, I've talked with the tech transfer officer at Yale about this case and some of the student activists. Tech transfer officer said, yes, well, that was in a day where universities were not careful about reserving use, so basically not protecting against the deployment of patents in developing countries. It was before that was on our radar screen. But Yale couldn't do anything at that point. They had already licensed this to Bristol Myers Squibb. And so the head student activist, or they tracked down the scientist. They came to see you. This guy Prusoff, who was very involved, who had the foundational patent. Prusoff, he's like, I had no idea that this was being denied people in South Africa. So, but he was, this drug was pulling in $40 million a year for Yale. So he knew that some big-time money was coming into him and his lab. But he wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, basically saying, I am in favor of providing this drug in South Africa. And the next day, Bristol Myers Squibb lowered their price. So they basically made it at a generic. They allowed generics to come in. So I guess the part of the moral of the story is that this contract between science and society isn't clear. It's not clear-cut. It's messy. It's being worked out in practice through particular drugs, particular deals. But that around some of these controversies, whether it's Zerit or the BP deal here or whatever it is, these are times when we are kind of actively negotiating, figuring out, well, what are the boundaries of the entrepreneurial university? What does it mean? What is our understanding of the value of exclusivity? What's given up? What isn't given up? What kind of university do we want? And that rather than seeing the kinds of debates, and this is my version, you don't have to agree with this, but rather than seeing these moments as necessarily delays, I think they're important moments, political moments, where we're coming to terms with what we want our university to be, or what we want our scientists to be. And it's a time for people to make cases on many sides of the issue. So I would, as up-and-coming scientific stars, I would counsel you to get engaged in these kinds of discussions, because you should be participating, and not necessarily in kind of a knee-jerk way. I mean, let's understand the contexts, and let's help create a vision of what the university should be. Well, there are a few minutes left, so if there are any questions or remaining problems? Okay, so let's end here, and if anyone wants to chat for a bit, I'll be here. Oh, okay, go for it.
What's a land-grant university?
Oh, shit. Okay, a land-grant university. In the 1860s, under Lincoln, during the Civil War, he and his administration, of course, was very concerned about expanding the number of free states. And that meant introducing a version of agriculture that didn't rely on slaves. And so part of the idea was we'd give a lot of money, a grant of money to these new states to create universities that will extend agricultural knowledge into society, allowing farmers to thrive economically, to have an advantage. And California was one of the land-grant states. So University of California, Iowa, Cornell had one, MIT started that way. Many of the major state universities that we know were created during that period. Now here, the remnant of the land-grant college is my college, the College of Natural Resources. So this was a school of agriculture, and then became a school of forestry. And the whole point was it was this sort of two-way street where knowledge is generated, you have extension specialists who go out, people, foresters and sort of folks come back in, bringing in ideas, and it was this sort of osmotic kind of vision of the university. And to some extent that remains, but it's very much part of the history of the American university and of this university. So you guys should embrace that. Okay, thank you. Thanks very much.